Walls create barriers that prevent people from crossing. So you can go and look at the Great Wall of China or the Berlin Wall, and both of those walls were constructed to keep certain populations from entering the area of another population. Or you can think about the Green Monster in Boston. That's a wall that serves as a barrier between the on-field play and what's out of field. Or maybe a better way to say that is, it's a barrier between the batter and a home run. And then, of course, there's the gum wall. The gum wall is a barrier between me and ever visiting that location. That is disgusting. I have no interest in ever seeing that. And like I said, I start by talking about walls because a wall is a primary feature in our study of the Exodus today. Many of you already know what's coming, but in case you don't, it's time for us to visit Joshua chapter 6 and examine the episode of the Exodus in which the Israelites came face to face with the walls of Jericho. Now, I want to talk about these walls for a little bit. I want us to understand exactly what it is that the Israelites are facing. Because I remember as a child going to VBS, and we had these cardboard boxes stacked up, I think about 6 high, and they toppled in the middle of the VBS. But these walls are much more significant than that. Pictured on the screen is the archaeological site of Jericho known as Tel Es Sultan. You can see it's a large mound. It's where the city of Jericho existed for millennia. What is particularly fascinating about Jericho is that people have lived here so long, it has been identified as one of the oldest cities in the world, and it is particularly noteworthy for being the oldest fortified city in the world. The excavations of Jericho have revealed that the mound of Jericho was surrounded by a great earthen rampart or embankment with a stone retaining wall at its base. The retaining wall was 12 to 15 feet high. So Jericho's base was already raised off the ground higher than a basketball goal. That means Jericho was an elevated city, which is evident just by looking at the mound it occupies today. And being an elevated city gave it a sense of protection immediately, but their defensive measures didn't stop there. On top of the retaining wall was a mud brick wall that was 6 feet thick and at least another 8 feet high, with some evidence suggesting it was about 20 to 26 feet high. And this wall encircled an area about 9 acres in diameter, well, about 9 acres total. So in addition to the city being elevated off the ground around it, it was encircled by a massive wall that would have made accessibility into the city require you to scale a minimum 20-foot structure. But it doesn't stop there. The diagram on the screen is a cutaway of what the city would have looked like as far as its elevation and its fortifications. See, the ground inside that outer wall continued to slope upward another 15 feet to a second upper wall that was also made of mud brick. And this wall encircled an area of approximately 6 acres. Thus, Jericho was an elevated city whose mound actually reaches 78 feet at its maximum height. And in its heyday, it was protected by an exterior wall that at least rose 20 feet from ground level, and an interior wall within that. And so a diagram of the city would have looked something like that. We're not just talking about a single wall. We're talking about an elevated mound with 2 walls that would have to be penetrated. What we're talking about is a city that is so incredibly defended that it's existed for millennia. And if you're wondering where Rahab's house would have been located, well, excavations have shown that there were residential houses built in that space between the two walls, that 15-foot or so space between those two walls. And excavations have shown that those houses used the exterior wall as the back of their house. Now that we've got a sense of what kind of fortification we're dealing with at Jericho, I want you to imagine what was going through the minds of the Israelites when they first laid eyes on this intimidating structure. They walk up to the city of Jericho, and it says that the city was shut up inside and outside so that none went out and none came in. Imagine walking up to this mound, seeing this double-walled structure, seeing the heights at which it rose. As they stood at the base of the city looking up at the walls towering over them, I wonder if they thought to themselves something like this: what are we even doing here? How in the world are we going to get in there? That's impossible. These walls are impenetrable. We've won a lot of battles, but it's always been out in the plains or out in the wilderness or out in the valleys. It's never been a battle up against a double-walled city on a mound. We've never had to attack something like this. This is not doable. There's no way we can scale or break through these walls. Now, they may or may not have thought about that, but certainly we have. We may not find ourselves standing in front of an imposing physical wall like the walls of Jericho, but we have found ourselves standing in front of imposing figurative walls. It may be a health situation. Maybe you're waiting on some test results or have received an intimidating diagnosis, and you're staring at that wall, wondering what you're going to do. How are you going to beat this? Are you going to be able to withstand the treatment? Maybe you're currently undergoing treatments or currently undergoing rehabilitation. It's just taking a toll on your body. And you're staring at that wall, unsure how you're going to endure through all of the treatments and all of the rehab you have to go through. But maybe it's a financial situation. Maybe you recently lost your job, and you're staring at that wall of bills, wondering how they're going to get paid. Maybe you've encountered an unexpected major expense, or you just simply keep looking at the prices of things going up, and you're wondering how you're going to be able to afford everything next month. Maybe your wall is relational. Maybe your marriage is struggling, or you've had a falling out with someone you love. And you're staring at that wall, that separation between you and someone you love, and you're wondering how you'll ever be able to overcome it and repair the relationship. Maybe it's an addiction. Maybe you're struggling with an addiction to alcohol or narcotics or pornography or gambling or food. And it's become this giant barrier in your life, and you just don't know how to topple it. It may even be an emotional wall. Maybe you're battling guilt or anxiety or grief or bitterness, and the emotional turmoil you're experiencing has become a wall that's negatively impacting your life, and you need help overcoming it. I'm certain that every one of us can reflect on a wall that we've run into. That every one of us has had a wall at some point in our lives, and we're standing there looking at it, and we don't know what to do next. We may not face a physical, fortified structure like the Israelites, but we know what it's like to stand at the base of a wall. And we're sitting there looking at it, and it's intimidating. And from our vantage point, it's insurmountable. and impenetrable. And this morning, as we look at the events of Joshua chapter 6, there's really not a lot for us to dig into theologically and textually. It's a pretty simple narrative. They come up to the walls, God gives them instructions, they follow the instructions, and the walls fall down. So I guess you can go home now. But I think it's an incredibly applicable story, an incredible practical story for us, because we know what it's like to be in front of walls. And if you're facing a wall right now, the story of Jericho has a message for you. And I'm going to boil it down to two things. Two things for you to do when you hit walls. And it's not rocket science. It's not anything you've never heard before, but maybe by putting it in this context, it's helpful. The first thing I recommend you do when you encounter a wall is recall what God has already done for you. What's so very interesting about the fall of Jericho is that it's designed to be the perfect bookend for the entire Exodus. Here's what I mean. Do you remember what the very first obstacle was that the Israelites encountered when they left Egypt? It was the Red Sea. And how were they able to cross the Red Sea? Well, Exodus chapter 14, verse 21 and 22 tells us that Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night and made the sea dry land. And the waters were divided, and the people of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, the waters being a wall to them on their right and on their left. Their journey out of Egypt began with this miraculous parting of the waters of the Red Sea so they could cross on dry land. Do you know what happened shortly before the Israelites arrived at Jericho? They had to cross the Jordan River. And we're told that the Jordan River was overflowing all its banks because it was that time of year. And I want you to look now in Joshua chapter 3, verse 14 through 17, at what we're told about this river crossing. So when the people set out from their tents to pass over the Jordan, with the priest bearing the Ark of the Covenant before the people, and as soon as those bearing the Ark had come as far as the Jordan, and the feet of the priests bearing the Ark were dipped in the brink of the waters coming down from above stood and rose up in a heap very far away at Adam, the city that is beside Zarethan. And those flowing down toward the Sea of the Arabah, the Salt Sea, were completely cut off, and the people passed over opposite Jericho. Now the priests bearing the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord stood firmly on dry ground in the midst of the Jordan, and all Israel was passing over on dry ground until all the nation finished passing over the Jordan. I don't think this is a coincidence that the Exodus begins with the crossing of the Red Sea on dry land, and they finally enter the Promised Land by crossing over a flooded river on dry land. But that's not the only similarity I want to point out. Do you remember what the last thing was that the Israelites had to do in Egypt before they left? They had to observe the Passover. If you go back to Exodus chapter 12, it records their observance of that first Passover and how Moses instructed them in verses 24 and 25 to observe this rite as a statute for you and for your sons forever. And when you come to the land that the Lord will give you, as he has promised, you shall keep this service. The night before they took off on this journey homeward, they observed the Passover. And they were told that you will observe this again when you enter the Promised Land. Now, if you jump back to the text of Joshua, and in particular to Joshua chapter 5 and verse 10, which is just a few verses before we enter the 6th chapter and Jericho, here's what we're told. While the people of Israel were encamped at Gilgal, They kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month in the evening on the plains of Jericho. In other words, after they had crossed the Jordan River, the first thing they did was observe the Passover. Well, actually, it's not the first thing they did. Every male had to get circumcised first, then they observed the Passover. Figured I wouldn't spend too much time on that part, though. Now, here's what I want you to grasp about these events. They are paralleling each other on purpose. The Exodus began when God miraculously defeated the Egyptians via the plagues. Before they took off on their journey, though, the Israelites observed the very first Passover. Then, just as their journey was getting started, they encountered a body of water that God had to dry up in order for them to cross. Now we're at the end of that Exodus, and we're entering the Promised Land. And it's so very fascinating because the order is reversed now. The Israelites encountered a body of water that God had to dry up in order for them to cross. And once they crossed that, they observed the first Passover in the Promised Land. And now they stand outside Jericho. And what should they expect from God based on the historical record? They should expect Him to miraculously conquer their opponents, just like He did back in Egypt with those plagues. You see, God is reminding the Israelites that He's got this by having them relive the initial events of the Exodus, but in reverse order. We need to understand that God gave us the ability to remember for a reason. We have memory for a reason. Remembering enables us to be thankful. You know, as Moses taught the Israelites how to observe the first Passover back there in Exodus chapter 13, he instructed them to remember this day in which you came out from Egypt, out of the house of slavery, for by a strong hand the Lord brought you out from this place. The purpose of the Passover was for it to be a memorial that constantly reminded the Israelites what God had done for them, so they would never forget to be thankful. And with that in mind, it's no wonder that the Lord's Supper was born out of the Passover. During His last observance of the Passover before His death, we're told that Jesus took bread, broke it, and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And then He took the cup and said, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me." What Jesus was doing was instituting a new memorial designed to constantly remind us what He had done for us so that we will never forget to be thankful. Remembering is important because it creates gratitude. Our memory of what God has done for us will also create courage. Because if we can remember what He did, we'll have the courage to move forward with what He's going to do. God has given us the ability to recall the past. And if we use it for His glory, in the sense that we use it to remember what He's done, then there's nothing that will stand in front of us that can't be toppled, because God's already toppled the hard stuff in the past. He's already toppled your sin problem. So why should you ever fear or be intimidated by anything else in the future? Because He's already taken care of your greatest crisis. What God has done for you in the past should dictate how you approach the future. So when you face a wall, recall what God has done for you. But you know why else remembering is important? Because it enables us to correct ourselves when we get off course. The church in Ephesus was instructed in Revelation chapter 2 and verse 5 to remember from where you have fallen. And they needed to remember because they needed to return to doing the works they did at first. And then just one chapter later, the church in Sardis was instructed to remember what you received and heard, because they needed to wake up and keep or obey what they had been taught. And in both of these letters, there's the same call, the same instruction, the instruction to repent. Both churches had gotten off course. And when Jesus wrote a letter to them, he said, I want you to remember where you came from. I want you to remember what you did at first. I want you to remember what you've been taught. I want you to use your recall because it will correct you and put you back on the course you ought to be going. And think about those Israelites. For so long, they had disrespected God, disobeyed God, and they had frustrated God and angered God, all because they kept forgetting where they came from, kept forgetting whose they were, kept forgetting what their mission was. And remembering enables us to correct ourselves in those moments where we veer off course. So as they stand before this wall, two things are being accomplished by reimagining the origins of the Exodus. They're recalling what God had done to bring about their salvation. And they're recalling what they're supposed to do as people in a covenant relationship with Him. Remembering might be our greatest asset when we encounter walls. But the other thing we need to do when walls rise before us is we need to follow. When we encounter a wall, follow God's instructions. In particular, follow God's instructions regardless of whether or not they make sense. I know I'm not telling you anything new when I say we need to follow God's instructions. But I think sometimes we get caught up with trying to decide whether or not it makes sense to follow those instructions. I want you to put yourself in the shoes of the Israelites here. When they arrived at Jericho, they're given a list of things to do and a list of things not to do. They're told in verses 6 through 4 to march around the city and to shout with a great shout when they heard the sound of the trumpet on the seventh day after they had marched around the city 7 times. Their instructions collectively boil down to this. Everybody has this responsibility to march, to shout. And then they're told some things not to do. You can see this particularly between verse 10 through 18. They were told not to make your voice heard or let any word go out of your mouth until the time they were instructed to shout. And they were told not to keep any of the things devoted to destruction. That means the spoils of war for themselves in verse 18. They've got some things they are supposed to do and some things they're not supposed to do. And I'm certain it didn't make sense to the Israelites that their entire military strategy involved marching and shouting. These are the same people who defeated the Amorite armies of King Sihon and King Og just a short time ago by actually engaging in physical battle. And now, against an opponent with better defenses, all God wants them to do is march and shout. That doesn't make much sense to them, I imagine. And they were probably some among them who didn't understand why they couldn't talk during their daily marches or why they wouldn't be allowed to take anything when they left. It's not like the residents of Jericho didn't know they were there. They had shut up the gate of the city because they saw them there. It's not like they're going to be walking around the city and then somebody whispers something to somebody else and all of a sudden the Jericho residents are like, hey, look who's out there. They already knew. And when they left Egypt, they were instructed by God to take silver, gold, and clothes from the Egyptians. They were blessed by God with the opportunity to take from the Egyptians when they left there. And now they're at Jericho and God says, don't touch anything. Don't take anything. It's all off limits. It doesn't make sense. I'm certain there's someone in there who is thinking this doesn't make sense. So whether you're looking at the things God instructed them to do or the things God instructed them not to do, there's probably someone who sees the lack of logic. You know how I know that? Because we do the same thing. We have things God has instructed us to do and things He has instructed us not to do, and at times those things don't make sense to us. Don't believe me? For some, the instruction in Romans chapter 12 and verse 14 to bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse, doesn't make sense. I didn't put it up here. That's right. Bless those who persecute you. Does that make sense? Someone's wronged you, and your response is not to retaliate, not to get revenge, not to seek justice. Your response is to bless them. We are in a culture where we have been trained, where we have adopted the mentality that we have the right to retaliate, the right to get even, the right for things to be made right. We're all about our rights. We're all about fairness. So it just doesn't make sense to some of us for us to be wronged and justice to not be served. But God said, bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse them. For others of us, the instruction in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 34 doesn't make much sense. It's there that Paul indicates that women are to keep silent in the churches. And that just doesn't make sense because there are plenty of women who are spiritually and intellectually superior to most men. And yet they're not allowed to share their knowledge, use their talents and abilities. It doesn't make sense. And then there are others who hear the instruction in 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 13 to be subject to every human institution. And that makes no sense because governments and government officials throughout history have often been evil, corrupt, and at times antagonistic toward Christianity, leaving Christians to wonder why we should even submit to them. And yet it's there. Now, I don't have time to go into detail on all these passages, explaining their significance and why God included them and why we should be obedient to them. What I want you to understand is that there are instructions God gives that we are at times going to look at and say, that doesn't make sense. But following God isn't about appeasing our logic. Following God is about trusting that He knows what's best. That He's greater than anything in this world. And that in the end, He'll take care of us. And so I'm reminded of the encounter Jesus had with an unidentified rich ruler, which is recorded in Luke chapter 18. It's one of those stories that we often use. I've used it just last Sunday night as he talked about contentment. But if you recall, the rich young ruler asked Jesus, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus responded by indicating that he needed to keep the commandments. And the rich young ruler responded by saying that he had kept all of the commandments that Jesus mentioned ever since he was a child. And I believe him. I think he actually had. But there was still something missing. And that's when Jesus pointed out the one thing this individual had refused to give up for the sake of following him. Luke chapter 18, verse 22, Jesus said, "One thing you still lack. Sell all that you have and distribute to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come follow me." Now, it didn't make sense for this guy to sell everything. What would he eat? Where would he live? How would he survive? But that's precisely the point Jesus was making. There was one part of this guy's life where he was holding back and refusing to truly follow. So Jesus pointed to the one part of this guy's life that he was unwilling to relinquish and told him that if he wanted to secure his salvation, he'd have to be willing to surrender everything, including his finances. Now, what does this have to do with walls? I want you to think about it this way. When you encounter walls, some of them may have been constructed because you weren't following God in the first place. Not all of them, but some of them. And they're certainly not going to get deconstructed, or demolished would be a much better word, Kyle, if you don't start following Him. Essentially, a refusal to follow is never going to help your wall situation. But choosing to follow will. And so if we want God to tear down our walls, then we're going to have to follow His lead by doing what He's instructed us to do and refraining from doing those things He's instructed us not to do. That may mean that we have to give up some things that we don't really want to give up. That may mean we have to separate ourselves from some people and or some situations that we're not just really ready to give up. That may mean that we have to face some consequences or endure some negative experiences that we'd prefer to avoid. That may mean I have to make some lifestyle changes that I don't really want to make. That may mean I have to take on some commitments that I've done a good job of avoiding so far. That may mean we have to do something we're uncomfortable doing. And that may mean that we don't get to enjoy some things we want to keep enjoying. But if God is going to tear down our walls, He requires our complete obedience, even in the things that don't make sense. Whether that be remaining quiet while you walk around a city, or whether that be heeding the instructions He provides in His Word. We just need to remember that our God is the one who is greater than whatever is in this world, as John mentions in 1 John chapter 4 and verse 4. God's the one who can truly take care of the walls. God's the one who made Jericho fall. There wasn't a thing the Israelites did to bring that wall down, and that was precisely the point. God is the wall breaker. It's really just a matter of whether or not we're going to trust Him to take care of the walls for us. It's very interesting. On June 12, 1987, at the Brandenburg Gate, which was part of the Berlin Wall, President Ronald Reagan delivered a speech commonly known by a key line from the middle part where he said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Now, in fairness, Reagan's words really didn't make the wall come down. But it was a position and a mindset that eventually did lead to the tearing down of the Berlin Wall. What's interesting to me is that Ronald Reagan did not have the authority or the ability to tear down the Berlin Wall. All he had was an avenue to appeal to the one who could see to its ultimate destruction. The same is true for us. We're not capable of tearing down our walls, but we have access to the one who can. And if you're facing a wall today, you're invited to call on the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords to take care of it for you. That's really the message of this morning. If there's a wall in your life interfering, intimidating, negatively impacting, whatever it may be, know that you have a God in heaven who can take care of it for you. But you have to be willing to turn it over to Him. If you have any need to respond to that invitation this morning, then we offer it while together we stand and sing.